You feel ashamed, you feel violated, you feel embarrassed.
When we were growing up, it was good.
I invested $150,000.
We screwed over almost 1,000 people. That's a lot of people.
Why isn't anybody going to jail?
You think the court system's going to help you out, and then the court system just takes all your money.
I honest to God don't know how he sleeps at night.
For years, cattle ranchers and investors were amazed by the financial genius of Mark Ray. The man seemed to run one of the most successful and oddly generous cattle investment operations on the entire planet. With his disarming charm and unshakable confidence, he pulled in hundreds of millions of dollars from eager investors, all chasing the promise of sky-high returns, sometimes more than 25% in just a matter of months. Everyone wanted in, and it really was brilliant. Or rather, that's how it all seemed. Because little did everyone know that behind the scenes, Mark had built up everything on lies. There were no cattle, no sprawling farms, in fact, no real investments at all. Just a giant, carefully spun illusion. One that made Mark and his co-conspirators filthy rich, at least for a while, and left hundreds of everyday people crushed in the fallout. Now, this might sound like a once-in-a-generation betrayal. After all, $500 million was siphoned from ordinary families, but it's really anything but one of a kind. In fact, it's really part of a growing pattern.
Concerns growing this evening among Texas ranchers.
Neighbors and your relatives say they're out millions of dollars. What happened to the money, Bob?
Nearly 30,000 missing cows.
And what's being called a cattle Ponzi scheme.
See, in recent years, there's been a sharp rise in con artists pulling the exact same stunt that Mark did. Many of them getting away with it at least long enough to do some real damage. That's why I wanted to make this video, because as these schemes grow in number and complexity, I think it's time we finally break everything down. Not just Mark's story, but the entire picture. So we can once and for all understand how these frauds work, how they still slip past the system, and most importantly, how we can spot them before they spot us. Let me start off with the structure these scams follow. And that begins with the story of one very specific man, the man who created the very playbook these schemes were built on, Charles Ponzi. It's the roaring 20s. The First World War has just come to an end. Stocks are climbing faster than ever. Radios are crackling, and America is stepping into its golden age. And it's here that we meet our man Charles. A well-dressed Italian immigrant with dreams as big as his smile, Charles had always wanted to be rich. He'd tried and failed and tried again at plenty of different ventures before, but now with the 1920s just kicking off, he was ready to try again. And this time, he was sure it would work. Because his plan was to start an investment company, but with a little twist. Instead of collecting investments and building some complicated system to actually generate real profits of say 5 or 10% a year, he was going to skip all of that, make it simpler, and promise much bigger returns. The pitch was straightforward. He'd market it as a golden opportunity. Invest $10,000 today, and in just 45 days, you'll get a 50% return, or if you wait 90 days, you'll get a 100% return. A very attractive proposition for anyone chasing a quick buck, right? But there was a hidden catch. One that he wouldn't tell the investors. These funds would never actually get invested. See, Charles would keep a big chunk for himself. He was chasing that luxury life after all, and then use the remaining funds to pay off earlier investors. Because when those early investors saw those huge returns, not only would they be convinced it's all legit, but they'd reinvest or bring in friends or both. Charles's optimism made sense. It was a straightforward but effective formula that proved perfect in theory. And when he launched the Securities Exchange Company in January of 1920, that optimism was, at least temporarily, proven right. People jumped at the opportunity because they loved it. Finally, it seemed someone had cracked the code to make everyone get rich quick, and his name was Charles. When skeptics asked how he was pulling off these wild returns, he just smiled and said he couldn't reveal his secret for competitive reasons. But while the scheme worked like a charm for a while, one glaring flaw did start to emerge, one he hadn't actually planned for. He needed a constant stream of new investors. Because with no real profits being made, the only way to pay out the old investors was with the money from the new ones. And that's a problem that mathematically can't last forever. Sooner or later, that flow would slow down. And of course, add in any public suspicion or worse, a legal probe, and that could start the domino effect. This is exactly what would go on to happen for Ponzi. Eventually, the pool of new investors started to dry up. Then came a damaging Boston Post article laying out exactly what his whole operation was, a fraud. And then everything collapses in its entirety. Now, while this marked the end of Charles's dream of financial success, it was really just the beginning of what he had just set in motion. But before we go one layer deeper on that, I want to take a minute to thank the sponsor of today's video, Remitly. Remitly is a money transfer app and website that helps you send money all over the world. If, like me, you've had experience sending international wire transfers or just trying to send money overseas, you know how confusing and difficult it can be. And most of the time, you're left to figure it out on your own and just hope that your money gets to where you want it to go. But luckily, Remitly makes the process completely painless with their great exchange rates and zero hidden fees. Remitly serves over 170 plus countries with their fast transfers, and they even guarantee on-time delivery. They offer several delivery methods such as bank deposits, cash pickups, and mobile wallets depending on the recipient's location, so you can be sure that your money will arrive safe and on time. Sign up using my link in the description below or scan the QR code on the screen and use code GRANT to get a discount on your first transfer. Thank you again to Remitly for sponsoring the channel. Now let's get back to our guy, Mark, the guy running what was supposedly one of the most successful cattle investment operations on the planet. Yeah, that guy. Well, by now you already know the blueprint he used, the same recycled playbook every Ponzi scheme uses, so I won't waste time rehashing it. Instead, I want to circle back to Mark's story so we can use it to unravel a question we left hanging earlier. How is it that scams like this, even more than a century after Ponzi became a universal warning, still manage not only to slip through the cracks, but to flourish? Well, after digging into Mark's story, I think it comes down to three key things. Starting with this, the Ponzi scheme scams clothes have changed. Back in the day, these scams usually played out in slick Wall Street offices or were confined to just finance.
Bernard Madoff, the man behind the colossal Ponzi scheme that bilked thousands of people out of millions of dollars.
The FBI arrested him this morning after he told senior employees yesterday that his business was a giant Ponzi scheme.
Madoff confessed he hadn't made a single trade in years.
So naturally, that's still where most people assume they live. Or maybe with a modern twist like crypto or some sketchy tech startup. But really, that idea is way out of date. I mean, just look at Mark's setup and the costume it wore. He rooted his con in agriculture and in cattle investments, one of the most down-to-earth, trust-heavy industries there is. He had a background in the industry and he dressed the part. Cowboy boots, big hat, easy Southern charm. As Joshua Mays from the SEC's enforcement division put it, he would go to cattle shows, compete for awards, and rub shoulders with people who thought he was legit. Salt of the earth farmers, ranchers, business people, and average Joes. He fooled them all with just a handshake. People didn't expect a scam like this to erupt in that kind of industry, let alone from someone as trusted as Mark. So despite many of the victims likely being aware of Ponzi schemes beforehand, its evolution into wearing these clothes that no one expects is what allows it to continue. The second reason, cover sophistication. See, while Charles Ponzi from earlier did set up a real company to run his scam, the Securities Exchange Company, that's about where the effort stopped. No serious attempts to dress it up, just enough to run the scam. Now, while that's how these scams used to look, today's schemes operate on an entirely different level. Take Mark and his crew, for example. They had their roles down to a science to ensure a proper cover-up. This lady, Riva, she handled the banking. That means she managed all of the accounts, wired funds, and signed checks. Essentially, she kept everything looking clean on paper so as not to set off any alarms. Then the other co-conspirator, Ron, he wrote and ensured that every single email, investor update, and so-called official message was polished and professional. And in the span of 17 months, Mark, Riva, and Ron were able to haul in $650 million from victims all over the country, selling cows that didn't even exist. To put that into perspective, $650 million would buy you over 260,000 cows at the average price of $2,500. And even the biggest ranches in the country have an average cattle herd of 900 to 1,000 cows at any given time. So this was no small operation. And when you break down the numbers like that, it is crazy that they were able to get away with it. Now, sure, no scams cover is ever truly airtight, not Ponzi's, not Mark, Riva, and Ron's, not anyone's. But the level of trickery these modern operations pull off makes them a lot harder to spot and way easier to fall for. Because at the end of the day, we are wired to rationalize the things we want to believe. So when you're seeing massive returns and everything looks buttoned up and legit, it's no wonder people get pulled in. This brings us to the third and final reason: systemic flaws. To get into this, I want to zoom out and tie back to the broader trend we touched on earlier by looking at a different case. One that captures the point a little too perfectly. The case of Brian McLean, or as some have called him, the Bernie Madoff of cows. As the nickname suggests, just like Mark, he ran a ghost cattle Ponzi scheme. He promised investors insane 30% returns and claimed to manage over 88,000 head of cattle to generate those profits, even though in reality, he followed the same rob Peter to pay Paul formula and only had about 10,000 cattle on hand. It's a pretty dramatic story, and he actually took his own life just days before it all unraveled. But that's not the part I want to focus on today. Instead, I want to zero in on one recent event that's unfolded after the scam's collapse. Victims of the scheme have come together to file a class action lawsuit, not against McLean, but against 3 major banks. They're alleging that the banks enabled the fraud and ignored it. To quote directly from what's being alleged, RABO AgriFinance extended over $70 million in credit to McLean despite internal concerns about his poor record keeping, inability to verify cattle ownership, and other red flags. Now, I'm not going to comment on exactly what I think is true or not. That's still being figured out, and for legal reasons, I won't speculate. But I do still think it highlights a pretty ugly flaw in the system, one that helps explain why these scams keep popping up. See, from a purely financial standpoint, banks and institutions are always incentivized to grow. More clients means more loans means more upside. It's simple. And when we apply this to the logic we talked about earlier, the human tendency to rationalize and justify things we already want to do, you can probably see the problem that emerges. Banks and institutions may slightly overlook red flags, not because they don't see them, but because acknowledging them would mean pulling the brakes on something profitable. While I don't think these institutions are evil by default for this, any more than the victims were foolish, it's an unfortunate situation nonetheless. The fact that 2 separate Ponzi schemes have been exposed in the same industry in just the past few years should tell you something. This so-called ancient scam is far from dead. Disguised in new clothes, wrapped in an ever-evolving sophistication, and fueled by the incentives inside of our banks and financial firms, these scams aren't going anywhere. And make no mistake, there are almost certainly dozens, if not hundreds of Ponzi schemes running across different industries right now. So what's the real takeaway here? Well, you've got to go beyond the standard advice to just be cautious. Anytime the returns seem too good to be true, regardless of the sector and how trustworthy the front man seems, they probably are. Every time you consider investing, take the time to dig deeper, look past the surface, and check the business behind it. And most importantly, do that yourself. Because if you're relying on someone else to do the digging, chances are their interests might not fully line up with yours. And if you found this video interesting, you probably also want to check out this video about fast food, because just like Ponzi schemes, the promises rarely match the reality.